The day Effie Thatcher rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the autumn of 1882, she had exactly $3.40 in her coat pocket, a bruise still yellowing along her left cheekbone, and a quiet, ironclad decision inside her chest that no man would ever again make her feel like she owed him her silence. She had not planned on stopping in Caldwell. She had planned on riding straight through, on keeping the horse moving until she reached her sister's homestead near Dodge City, where she could breathe for a while without watching the door. But the horse, a sway-backed roan she had traded her silver brooch for outside of Wichita, had thrown a shoe 2 miles east of town, and so she walked the animal down the main street of Caldwell with her chin held level and her eyes steady, because she had learned long ago that the moment you looked like something was wrong, someone would either pity you or prey on you, and she had no use for either. Caldwell in the autumn of 1882 was a border town in every sense of the word. It sat right on the edge of Indian Territory, a place where cattle drives came through and left their noise and their money and their trouble, where the railroad had made men rich and then poor in the same season, where the law was thin as paper and twice as easily torn. There were good people there, same as anywhere. There were also the other kind. Effie was 28 years old. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches, with dark brown hair that she kept pinned up tight, and gray eyes that people sometimes found unsettling because they looked at things too directly, like they were measuring rather than simply seeing. She wore a plain brown coat, a practical skirt, and boots that had been good boots once. She had been married for 6 years to a man named Jacob Thatcher, and she had kept his name because it was hers now and she had paid for it, and she was not going to give back anything else. Jacob Thatcher had not been the kind of man who hit you right away. He had been the kind who wore you down slowly, like water on stone. He told her she was foolish until she believed it. He told her she was lucky to have him until she forgot that she had had a life before him. He took her money and her confidence and her sleep, and he did it all with a kind of cold, methodical patience that was more frightening than fury would have been. She had left him in the spring, after the winter had been particularly long and particularly mean, and she had ridden away on a borrowed horse in the gray dawn with her hands shaking on the reins and her heart hammering so hard she thought it might give out before she reached the county line. It had not given out. She had kept going. The farther she rode from Jacob Thatcher, the more she realized that the shaking in her hands was not fear. It was her own self coming back to her. She had not known how much of herself she had given away until she started getting it back, piece by piece, mile by mile. She found the blacksmith shop by following the ringing of a hammer, which led her to a low, wide building at the edge of the main street, where a man was working over an anvil with the focused, unhurried attention of someone who had done this same motion 10,000 times and knew how many more times he had left in him. He was not what she would have called a pretty man. He was broad through the shoulders in the way that came from actual labor rather than show, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a jaw that looked like it had been assembled from hard materials. He had a face that had spent a great deal of time outdoors, which meant it was weathered and honest-looking, the kind of face you could read clearly if you knew how to look. He wore no hat at that moment, which was unusual for a man working outside in cattle country, and he moved with a quiet, deliberate economy that she noticed because it was so different from the restless, claiming energy she had spent years bracing against. He looked up when she led the horse in, and he did not look at her the way some men did, the way that started at the top and moved down like they were appraising livestock. He looked at the horse first professionally and then at her, and his look was plain and without decoration. "Threw a shoe," she said, because she was not a woman who waited for someone else to state the obvious. 2 miles east, he said, not as a question. He had already seen the way the animal was walking. About that. He came around and lifted the hoof without asking permission, which she appreciated because asking permission in a situation that obviously required no deliberation was a kind of false courtesy she had always found exhausting. He looked at it for a moment, set it down gently. "I can have it shod by morning," he said, Sooner if nothing else comes in. How much? 50 cents. She had $3.40. 50 cents was manageable. All right, she said. He took the horse's lead and then he paused and he said without any particular weight in it, "There's a boarding house on the 2nd Street. Mrs. Calloway runs it. Clean, reasonable, and she doesn't ask questions." Effie looked at him for a moment, trying to determine the nature of the offer. It sounded like practical information, which was exactly what it was, and that was all. "Thank you," she said. She turned to go and he said, "Jacob Abbott," not offering his hand because his hands were black with work, but stating his name the way a man states something that he simply wants to be known. She turned back. "Effie Thatcher." He nodded once. She walked out into the afternoon sun. Mrs. Calloway's boarding house was exactly as described, clean, reasonable, and free of interrogation. The woman herself was a stout widow in her 60s with an efficient manner and kind eyes, who showed Effie to a small room on the 2nd floor that had a real bed and a window that looked out over the back lot where someone had planted a very determined kitchen garden. She brought a pitcher of water without being asked, and when she saw the fading bruise on Effie's cheek, she said nothing at all, which was exactly the right thing to do. Effie sat on the edge of the bed that night and looked at her hands in the lamplight. They were steady. She noticed that and she was glad. She had 50 cents in a jar inside a trunk, she thought. She had nothing else. She could not go to her sister's without the horse, and she could not get the horse without the 50 cents, and she had 50 cents, so that part was managed. What she needed was work. Not charity, work. In the morning, she rose before the sun and washed her face and pinned her hair and went downstairs, where Mrs. Calloway was already in the kitchen and the smell of coffee and cornbread filled the whole ground floor. "I need to find work," Effie told her, sitting at the kitchen table with both hands around the coffee cup because it was cold in the mornings now. "What's available in this town?" Mrs. Calloway looked at her appraisingly, not unkindly. "What can you do?" Effie thought about it honestly. "I can cook well enough, I can sew. I kept accounts for my husband's business." She paused. "I'm good with numbers." "Mercer's dry goods could use help," Mrs. Calloway said. "Old Tom Mercer's been running it alone since his wife passed. He's not bad to work for, just forgetful and a little deaf." "That'll do," Effie said. Tom Mercer was, as advertised, forgetful and hard of hearing, but he was also genuinely decent, with the particular goodness of a man who had been made tender by grief rather than bitter by it. His wife had died the previous winter, and he was running the store with the distracted inefficiency of a man who was still surprised, every morning, to find himself alone. His accounts were a disaster. His inventory was approximate at best. His ordering system appeared to have been organized by a reasonably intelligent cat. Effie spent her first 3 days simply making sense of things. She reorganized the shelves. She reconciled the ledger books going back 8 months, finding 2 errors that had been costing Tom money and 1 that had been costing a supplier money, and she corrected all 3. She learned quickly which customers came in every week and what they needed, and she learned to set it aside for them before they asked, which they appreciated in the way that people appreciate being known. She was good at her work. She had always been good at her work. Gerald had called it showing off. She understood now that what he had called showing off was simply competence, and he had resented it because it was hers and he could not claim it. She paid Tom Mercer for her first week before she took any wages, a transaction that confused him completely and made him blink at her over his spectacles for a long moment. "What's that for?" he asked. "Room and board," she said. "I've been eating your crackers." He waved his hand. "Those are for customers." "I'm not a customer," she said. "I work here." He looked at her for another long moment, then put the money in his pocket. "You're a very organized young woman," he said, as if this were an unusual diagnosis. "Yes," she said simply. "I am." It was on the 4th day, a Thursday, that Jacob Abbott came into the dry goods store. He came in at mid-morning, when the store was quiet, moving with the same unhurried deliberateness she had noticed the first time. He wore his hat now, a gray hat that had seen considerable weather, and his coat was clean if worn. He was buying nails, which told her nothing about him, and lamp oil, which told her he worked past dark, and a small bag of peppermints, which told her something she found unexpectedly touching. "Good morning," he said, and she could tell from the slight pause before he said it that he recognized her but was giving her the choice of whether to acknowledge the prior meeting or not. She appreciated that too, that careful, undemanding quality in the way he interacted with the world. "Good morning," she said. "Nails, lamp oil, and the peppermints. You've a good memory. It's useful in this work." He set his things on the counter and she tallied them, and she was aware of him watching her hands move through the motion of it, not in any presumptuous way, but with the interested attention of someone who appreciates skill being applied to a task. "You're working for Tom," he said. "I am. He needs it," he said. Then quickly, as if he wanted to make sure the meaning was clear, "The help. Not I only meant that he's been struggling since Mary passed." "I know what you meant," she said. She handed him his change and he pocketed it, and he stood for a moment, and then he said, in a tone of voice that was so carefully without pressure that she nearly smiled, "There's a supper social at the church hall this Saturday evening. Mrs. Calloway will be there and most of the town. It's a good meal is the main thing." It was such an honest way to put it, not a declaration, not a presumption, just an acknowledgement that a meal was a good meal. "I'll consider it," she said. He put his hat back on and walked out, and she watched him go through the front window, and she thought that she did not know what to make of a man who was so careful about not demanding anything. She had not met many men like that. In fact, she was not sure she had met any. She went to the church social. She wore the best dress she had, which was a deep blue wool that she had made herself 3 years ago, and which was simply cut but which fit her well, because she understood her own body in a practical way that had nothing to do with vanity. She did her hair differently, letting some of it fall loose at the back instead of pinning every strand, and she looked in the mirror above the washstand for a moment before leaving and decided that she looked like herself, which was the most she had ever aimed for, and also, she thought, the most she had ever wanted. The church hall was warm and loud, lit with oil lamps that made everything amber and generous. There were long tables covered with cloth and food that had been cooked by half the women in Caldwell, including a bread pudding with raisins that Mrs. Calloway had made and which was, as advertised, excellent. There was a fiddle player setting up in the corner, and children running between the table legs, and the low general roar of a community that was, at its best moments, actually a community. Jacob Abbott was standing near the far wall with a tin cup of cider, talking to a man she did not recognize, and she saw him see her when she came in the door. He did not come straight to her, which she liked. He waited, and then he crossed the room gradually, the way water moves, following the natural channels, not forcing anything. "You came," he said. "I did," she said. "The bread pudding was the deciding factor." He smiled then, and it changed his face considerably, not because it made him handsome in an obvious way, but because it made him look suddenly young and unguarded, like something underneath the weathered exterior had chosen to show itself for a moment. It was a good smile, genuine and unhurried. "The fiddle player is decent," he said, "if you like dancing." "I haven't danced in a long time," she said honestly. "Nor have I," he said. "I've forgotten most of the steps." She looked at him. "I doubt that." He found her a place to sit and brought her food without being asked, and without making a production of it, and they sat near the end of the table and ate and talked. And the conversation moved in the way that good conversation does, not in a straight line toward anything in particular, but branching and doubling back and occasionally arriving somewhere unexpected. She learned that he had come to Caldwell 7 years ago, in 1875, when the cattle trade was still booming, and a blacksmith with skill could set himself up if he was willing to work hard and save carefully. She learned that he had built his shop from the ground up, which was why it was low and wide, because he had built what he could afford at the time and added on as the money allowed. She learned that he had a horse named Fletcher, which he seemed slightly embarrassed to admit he was fond of, and that he had grown up in Missouri and had headed west with his father when he was 19, and his father had died the following spring of fever, and he had kept going because there was nothing to go back to. "Did that make you sad?" She asked because she was direct and because she genuinely wanted to know. He thought about it, which she appreciated. Men who answered too fast usually weren't answering the actual question. "It made me quiet," he said finally, "for a long time, but I found that the work helped. When you're making something, there's no room to be lost, do you know what I mean? Your hands know what to do and you follow them." She knew exactly what he meant. She had felt that in the store, in the clean ordering of things, the satisfaction of a problem becoming legible and then solvable. "I know what you mean," she said. The fiddle started up, a reel that filled the hall with light and motion, and people began to move from the tables toward the cleared space at the center, couples and pairs and small groups forming and reforming in the cheerful, slightly chaotic geometry of a country dance. Jacob stood and offered his hand, and she looked at it for a moment, that broad, work-darkened hand extended toward her with nothing demanding in the gesture, only an offering, and she took it. He had not forgotten the steps. Neither had she. They danced 2 reels and a slower turn that was not quite a waltz but had the same quality of nearness, and she was aware, through all of it, of how differently this felt from anything she had known in recent memory. The warmth of his hand was not possessive. The closeness was not a claim. He moved in relation to her as if they were 2 separate people choosing, moment by moment, to move together, and she felt something unknot in her chest that she had not realized was knotted. When the music stopped, she stepped back naturally and he let her, and that was the whole of it. Afterward, walking back to the boarding house in the October dark, with a slice of that bread pudding wrapped in cloth that Mrs. Calloway had pressed upon her, Effie thought about Jacob Abbott and about her own response to him. She was not naive. She knew that a man could be pleasant in public and entirely different in private. She knew that 6 months of apparent gentleness meant nothing, because Gerald had been pleasant for the first year and she had been young and grateful, and she had not known to look for the signs that came later. She was not young and grateful anymore. She was 28 and sharp, and she had learned to look at things clearly. What she saw when she looked at Jacob Abbott clearly was a man who had built a life with his hands and had not required anyone to be diminished in the building of it. What she saw was a man who listened more than he spoke, and who, when he spoke, said what he meant without embellishment or manipulation. What she saw was someone who had been lonely for a long time and had made peace with it without becoming mean about it. None of that meant she was going to rush anything. She had done rushing, and she had done it badly, and she was not going to do it again. But she walked back through the cold air with the bread pudding and something quietly warming in her chest, and she thought, "He is interesting. He is genuinely interesting." And that, after everything, was not nothing. The following weeks settled into a routine that had its own satisfying texture. Effie worked at Mercer's 6 days a week, and her capabilities there quickly became indispensable to the point where Tom Mercer raised her wages without being asked on the 4th week, pressing the extra coins into her hand with the air of a man who has finally remembered a thing he should have done earlier. She had saved enough by the 5th week to send a letter to her sister in Dodge City explaining where she was and that she was all right, and the reply came back in the 3rd week of October, 3 pages long, her sister's handwriting cramped with worry, and with things she had been holding back for a long time about Gerald Thatcher, things she had seen and suspected and had not known how to say. Effie read the letter twice and then folded it carefully and put it away, and she felt something settle further. It was good to be known. It was good to have been seen, even partially, even imperfectly. Jacob came into the store once a week, sometimes twice, and their conversations lengthened naturally, the way conversations do when 2 people find they have more to say to each other than they expected. He told her about the particular properties of different metals, about the way you learn to read a horse's shoe the same way you might read a person's face, about the small politics of Caldwell's business community, which she found both informative and entertaining. She told him about the logistics of running a dry goods store, about the mathematics of ordering and stock, about the customers she had come to know in the shorthand way of someone who sees people's weekly needs and can read a great deal from them. She did not tell him about Gerald. Not yet. She found she was not ready to tell it plainly yet, though she suspected he knew some version of it, because people in small towns know things without being told, and Mrs. Calloway was a woman who was kind without being incapable of observation. What she did tell him, on a Wednesday in the third week of October when the store was quiet and the afternoon sun was turning everything golden, was this: "I'm not in a hurry about anything." He had been leaning against the counter with his hat in his hands, and he looked at her when she said it, and she saw that he understood exactly what she meant, all of it, not just the surface. "Neither am I," he said. "Good," she said. And somehow that exchange was more intimate than anything else that had passed between them, because it was an acknowledgement that they were both aware of the same thing and had decided together, without pressure or performance, to let it be what it was. He began stopping by in the evening sometimes, after he had closed the smithy. He would sit in the chair by the counter, and she would keep doing the closing work, tallying the day's accounts, covering the goods, and they would talk, or sometimes sit quietly. And the quiet was comfortable, which surprised her because she had spent years in a house where silence had been a warning signal, and she had forgotten what it felt like when silence was simply rest. One evening he brought coffee in 2 tin cups from the diner across the way and handed her one without ceremony, and she held it in both hands and looked at him and said, "Tell me something true about yourself." He thought about it. "I talk to the horses when I'm working," he said. "Not to Fletcher, to all of them. I've done it since I was a boy, and my father said it was foolishness, but I've noticed they stand easier when you talk to them, so I don't think it is." "It's not foolishness," she said. "They respond to tone, they feel the intention in it." "Do you believe in intentions?" he asked. She looked at him squarely. "I believe in actions more, but I think intentions matter as a starting point." "That seems right," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Because something in the quality of his attention made honesty feel safe rather than foolish. My husband was very good at intentions. He intended to be kind, he said so often. The gap between the intention and the action was considerable." She watched his face carefully when she said it, not for pity because she did not want pity, for something else. For the way a man processes information like that, whether he moved toward it or away from it, whether he tried to fix it or fill it with platitudes or simply received it. Jacob Abbott received it. He said nothing for a moment, and then he said, quietly and without drama, "I'm sorry that happened to you." Not, "He must have had his reasons." Not, "Are you sure you understood him correctly?" Not, "That must have been difficult for both of you." Just, "I'm sorry that happened to you." Effie felt something move through her chest, warm and cautious like a flame in wind. "It's over now," she said. "Yes," he said. "It is." In November, the first hard frost came, and with it, a new development in Caldwell that brought a particular kind of trouble to the town's edges. A group of men had been running cattle across the border from Indian Territory without authorization, which was both illegal and incendiary, and the tension it generated ran through Caldwell like a current through water. The sheriff, a capable man named Marshal Dern, was stretched thin trying to manage it, and the saloons were loud at night in a way that put Effie in mind of weather before a storm. She was not afraid of this in the way she might have been once. She knew how to read a room. She knew how to move through a situation with her eyes open and her reactions controlled. She had spent 6 years married to a man who manufactured small crises specifically to throw her off balance, and what that had given her, among other terrible things, was a very clear-eyed calibration for actual danger versus noise. Jacob found her one morning at the store, and his face was set in the careful way that meant he was thinking about something he wasn't sure whether to say. "There's been some trouble at the edge of town," he said, "near the territory line. Nothing close, but I just wanted you to know, in case you hear things." She looked at him. "Are you worried about me?" He held her gaze. "Yes." It was so simple and so straightforward, without any of the performance of worry, the kind that was really about possession rather than concern. He was just simply worried about her safety, plainly, without complication. "I appreciate it," she said. "I'll be careful." "I know you will," he said. And that was different too, because he believed her, which meant he trusted her judgment rather than needing to manage her. And trust was something she had not been offered in a very long time. The trouble at the territory line resolved itself over the following 2 weeks through a combination of Marshal Dern's firm handling and the particular attention of the federal government, which sent 2 agents from Wichita who dealt with the cattle-running operation with the efficient authority of people who had paperwork and were not afraid to use it. It was a relief, and the town settled back into its rhythms like a river after a stone is removed from it. Through all of it, Effie and Jacob continued their evenings, their Wednesday conversations, their slow and careful learning of each other. She learned that he had read more than she would have expected, that he had a small library on the back shelf of his shop that included a battered volume of Shakespeare, an almanac from 3 years ago, and a translation of Marcus Aurelius that he had found at a trading post and that he reread in pieces when things were difficult. She learned that he was scrupulously fair in his business dealings, that he extended credit to people he knew were struggling and kept no record of it in a way that would embarrass them. She learned that he had a particular laugh, not frequent but real when it came, that started somewhere deep in his chest and arrived at his face unhurried. She let him learn things about her too. She told him that she had taught herself to read music as a child but had no instrument and no real skill, only the theory of it. She told him that she had a very strong opinion about bread, that most of it in her experience was inferior, and that one of her genuine pleasures in life was a perfectly baked loaf. She told him that she had been the kind of child who read everything she could find, who had found in books a liberty that her actual circumstances did not always provide. She told him that she was learning slowly to trust her own judgment again after years of having it questioned and undermined, and that some mornings she woke up and found she had done something in her sleep that she had been unable to do while awake, which was simply assume that she was right about things. "What kinds of things?" he asked. "Small things," she said. "Whether something is a good idea, whether a person means well, whether a feeling I have is true." He considered this. "And are you right?" "When you trust yourself." "Mostly," she said. "I was always mostly right, that's the thing. I was right about most of it, and I was made to feel that I was wrong, and it turned out the wrongness was not mine." She said it plainly, not dramatically, and he received it the same way. "That's a hard thing to recover from," he said. "It is," she said, "but I'm recovering." In December, she received a second letter from her sister, this one containing the information that Gerald Thatcher had remarried quickly, a woman from a neighboring county about whom her sister said little beyond the fact that she seemed quiet and young. Effie read this and felt something she examined carefully, turning it over like a stone in her hand. It was not grief. It was not jealousy. It was something closer to recognition, the recognition of a pattern that belonged to Gerald and not to her, and something that was almost pity, though she let herself feel only the edge of that before setting it down. She put the letter away and went back to work and was, she noticed, all right. The Saturday before Christmas, Jacob came to the store near closing time and stood in the doorway and said, with more care than his usual steadiness, "I'd like to take you to supper. At the hotel restaurant, if you'd like." She looked at him in his good coat, which he had clearly brushed, and his hat in his hands, and his expression that was steady but underneath it had a quality she recognized as hope held carefully, the way you hold something that might break. She felt warmth move through her entire chest. "I'd like that," she said. The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Caldwell, which was not saying an enormous amount, but it had real tablecloths and candles in glass holders, and a menu written in ink on a card, and the food was genuinely good. They sat across from each other and ate roasted chicken and potatoes, and a pie that was not as good as Mrs. Calloway's but was creditable, and they talked for 3 hours in the candlelight, the conversation moving through everything and nothing, through books and work and the nature of the Kansas sky in winter, through the past in careful degrees and the future in hypothetical terms. And at some point during the second hour, Effie realized that she was happy. Not the distant, theoretical happiness she had sometimes glimpsed in the months since leaving Gerald. Not the relief of safety. Actual happiness, present and specific and rooted in this particular table, this particular conversation, this particular man who was looking at her across the candle flame like she was something he found endlessly worth looking at. It frightened her a little. She let it. He walked her back to the boarding house and stopped at the bottom of the steps, and the December night was cold and clear, and the stars were extravagant overhead in the way they are in a place with no gas lighting to compete with them. "Effie," he said, and her name in his voice had a quality she could not quite translate, something warm and careful and entirely serious. "Jacob," she said. "I want you to know that he paused, collecting it. I'm not a man who says things for effect. I don't have a way with pretty words, but I find that I think about you a great deal and that it makes my days better, considerable better. And I wanted you to know that without any expectation attached to it." She looked at him in the cold night air, this man who had told her the truth of his feeling without ornamentation, without pressure, without a single string attached to it. "Without any expectation," she repeated. "None," he said. "You don't owe me anything for it. I wanted you to know." She stepped down off the first step so they were level, and she looked at him directly and she said, "I think about you too, and it makes my days better too. And I'm not ready to move quickly, but I want you to know that." He nodded, and that quiet pleasure moved through his face. "That's enough," he said. "More than enough. Good night, Jacob. Good night, Effie." She went inside and sat on her bed and listened to the cold silence of the December night, and held the feeling in her chest carefully, like something she was learning the dimensions of. Christmas came, and with it, a particular quality of light that was blue and sharp and beautiful in a way that required nothing added to it. Mrs. Calloway decorated the boarding house with pine boughs, and Tom Mercer closed the store for 2 days and gave Effie a small wrapped package that turned out to be a new pair of wool gloves, which she needed badly. She gave him back a jar of the apricot preserves she had been putting up on the weekends in the boarding house kitchen, and he held them and looked at them, and his eyes went soft in the way they did sometimes when he thought of his wife, and Effie quietly left him to it. She and Jacob spent Christmas Eve with a group that gathered at the Calloway house, 6 people who had no family nearby, or who simply belonged to the community more than they belonged to any particular blood. There was food and a fire and conversation, and at one point someone asked Jacob to tell a story, and he told a story about his first winter in Caldwell, when the snow came so fast and so heavy that the whole main street disappeared under it, and he had spent 2 days not going more than 20 feet from his forge, because he could not see beyond that in any direction, and how a stray dog had found its way to his shop door, and he had fed it from his own tin plate because there was nothing else. And the dog had stayed. "Where's the dog now?" someone asked. He smiled. "Died 4 years ago. Fletcher kept trying to get into the stall after she was gone. I think he missed her." It was such a small and genuine story, and the room was warmer for it, and Effie watched him from across the fire and felt something clarify inside her. Not a decision exactly, more like a recognition. The same recognition she had learned to trust again. He was good. Not perfect, because no person was perfect and she no longer wanted perfect, which was itself a kind of tyranny. But he was good, fundamentally and consistently, in the way that came from character rather than performance. In January, the new year of 1883 arrived with a cold snap that froze the water in the wash basins overnight and brought a particular quiet to the streets, the quiet of a place that has decided to wait until spring to fully resume its argument with itself. Effie worked and read and saved money and wrote long letters to her sister and shorter, warmer ones to Jacob, who had begun sending her notes sometimes instead of just visiting, short observations or things he had read that he thought she would find interesting. She found them all interesting. She found herself reading them more than once, and setting them in the drawer of the nightstand in a pile that grew slowly through January and February. One evening in late January, when the cold had given a little and there was the first suggestion of something less punishing in the air, she came into the smithy after closing the store, which she had begun doing occasionally, just appearing in the warmth and noise and smell of hot metal and honest work. She pulled up the low stool she had begun to think of as hers and watched him work, and they talked, and at some point the conversation found its way to something more fundamental. "What do you want?" she asked. It was a thing she found herself thinking about, the question of wanting. She had not been asked this question in years. She had not asked it of herself in years. She was asking it more now, and she wanted to know his answer because she found she genuinely, specifically wanted to know. He set down the piece he was working on and looked at her. "What kind of thing?" "Any kind of thing. What do you want from your life, from the time that's left of it?" He was quiet for a moment, and she watched him think it through rather than reaching for the easy answer. "I want to keep doing work I'm good at," he said. "I want the shop to be something that lasts. He paused. "I've been alone a long time, Effie. I've made peace with it, but if I'm being honest with you, I want a life that has someone in it, not as a cure for loneliness. I don't think that's the right reason to want someone, but because good things are better when they're shared and hard things are less hard, and I think that's true, and I've known it for a long time and just not had it." She held his gaze steadily. "That's honest," she said. "You asked," he said simply. "I did," she said. And then, because he had answered honestly and she owed him the same, "I'm still learning what I want. I know that sounds, after nearly 30 years, that might sound like I'm behind." "It doesn't sound like that at all," he said. "I spent 6 years having what I wanted decided for me," she said, "or told what I thought I wanted, and before that I was young enough that I wasn't really, the wanting was unformed, do you understand? I'm doing it fresh. Learning what it is I actually want when I'm the one doing the wanting." He nodded slowly. "And what have you found so far?" she considered. "I want to feel like myself. I want to work at something that uses the part of me that is best. I want to feel safe." She paused. "I want to feel seen by someone who is looking at the actual thing rather than the thing they want me to be." The fire in the forge crackled in the silence after she said it. "I see you," Jacob said, "exactly as you are, and I think what I see is remarkable." The word remarkable in his voice, with his particular economy of language, landed on her like light. Not flattery, not a move in a strategy, just the plain truth of what he thought, offered to her because she had offered hers. She stood up from the stool and walked the 2 steps between them, and she took his face in her hands, his warm, honest face, and she kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss. She had not done tentative in a long time. It was certain and quiet and warm, and his hands came to her waist, not claiming but receiving, and when they stepped back from each other, both of them slightly unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with balance, she felt the understanding settle between them like something long overdue. "Well," she said. "Yes," he agreed. She smiled, and it was the full kind of smile that she had not had cause to use very often, the kind that came from the center. He smiled back in that unhurried, revealing way, and they stood in the warm noise of the smithy in the January cold, and things between them were changed, and it was good. The spring came to Caldwell slowly, the way spring comes to the plains, not all at once but in increments, a degree of warmth here, a bird call there, a morning when the mud on the main street was soft rather than frozen, and then gradually, week by week, the world coming back to color. Effie noted all of it with a particular attention, because she was learning again how to notice things, how to be present in a life that felt like it belonged to her. She and Jacob were courting now, openly and simply, in the way that small towns recognize and accommodate, which is to say that everyone knew and most people approved. Mrs. Calloway approved with great energy. Tom Mercer approved with the distracted benevolence of a man who finds everything generally fine. Marshall Dern, who knew Jacob from 7 years of small-town proximity, said to Effie one morning at the store, "Abbott's a good man, one of the genuinely good ones," and said it the way a man says something he has simply observed to be true and sees no reason not to state. Effie filed this information alongside her own and found it consistent. In April, she received a visit at the store that she had not expected. The door opened on a warm Tuesday afternoon, and a man walked in whom she recognized, with a cold, arresting clarity, as Jacob Thatcher. He had found her through her sister, she would learn later, through the combination of an overheard conversation and a letter she should not have left on a table. He was thinner than she remembered and better dressed, which told her nothing good, because Gerald dressed up when he wanted something. He stood in the doorway of the store and looked at her, and his face had its familiar expression, the one that looked like patience but was actually calculation. She felt the fear, the old automatic fear, rise in her stomach like water. And then she felt something else rise alongside it, something she recognized as herself, the self she had been rebuilding since the gray morning she had ridden away. "Gerald," she said, and her voice was level. "Effie," he said, "you're looking well." "What do you want?" she asked. Not "what brings you here," not "how did you find me?" "What do you want?" She had learned to ask the direct question. He moved toward the counter and she did not step back because she had decided she was not going to step back. He said things then, all the familiar things, the things she had heard many times, that she was his wife, that she had a duty, that what they had was worth preserving. He said it in a voice that was persuasive and reasonable, and underneath it had that cold current she had learned to hear. She listened to all of it, she let him finish. And then she said, "I left you in April of last year. You have remarried. I know you have remarried. We have not been husband and wife in any real sense since before I left, and in the legal sense I have been in correspondence with an attorney in Wichita, and I will be continuing that correspondence. I am not going back with you. I am not anything to you anymore. You should go." He looked at her and she saw something pass through his face, the shift she had learned to read, from the reasonable expression to the real one underneath, the one that did not like being denied. "Effie," he said in a different voice. "I'd like you to leave the store," she said, "and I'd like you to leave Caldwell." The door opened at that moment, and Tom Mercer came in from the back, and he had poor hearing but he had very good eyes, and he looked at the situation with the clear-eyed perception of a man who had run a business for 30 years and knew what a threat in his establishment looked like. "Something I can help you with," Tom said, planting himself with the immovable quality of a man on his own ground. Gerald looked from Tom to Effie. Whatever calculation he ran in his head produced a result that made him straighten and put his hat back on. "Think on what I said," he told Effie. "I have thought on it," she said. "The answer is no." He left. Tom Mercer looked at her. She looked back. Her hands were steady. She noticed that. "You all right?" Tom asked. "Yes," she said, and she was. Frightened and angry and shaky under the calm, but herself throughout all of it, herself. She sent word to Jacob through Mrs. Calloway's young nephew, not from distress exactly, but because she wanted him to know, because she had decided that knowing and being known was what she wanted in her life. He came within the hour, which she recognized was not him rushing to rescue her, but him responding to the fact that she had told him something important. She told him exactly what had happened, all of it plainly. And then she told him about Gerald, the full version, the things she had not said before but which were now part of the context and needed to be part of the record between her and Jacob. She told it without performance, as a report of what had been, and he listened the same way, without trying to take it from her or make it into something he needed to react to heroically. When she was done, he said, "What do you need?" Not "what should we do?" Not "I'll handle it." "What do you need?" She thought about it honestly. "I need him to leave," she said. "I need to continue the legal correspondence. I need to know that this is my life and he can't touch it." "All right," he said. "Do you want me to speak to Marshall Dern?" "Yes," she said. Not on my behalf, because I'll do that myself tomorrow morning. But if you know him, if it would help for you to speak with him as well, then yes. I know him well enough, he said. Marshal Dern, when Effie spoke with him the next morning, was appropriately firm. Gerald Thatcher had been seen at one of the saloons the previous evening, and the marshal had the kind of authority that, in a border town where the law was always slightly improvised, depended as much on personal reputation as on official capacity, and his reputation was considerable. He spoke to Gerald that afternoon. Whatever passed between them had sufficient clarity that Gerald Thatcher boarded the eastbound stage the following morning and did not return to Caldwell. Effie watched the stage leave from the window of the store and felt something she could only describe as a door closing, not slamming, not breaking, just closing finally, completely, with a quiet and permanent click. She went back to her work. That evening, Jacob came to the store at closing time, as he often did, and she told him the stage had gone and Gerald with it, and he said, "Good," with a simplicity that was exactly right. They sat together in the closing warmth of the store and drank coffee and said very little, because the situation called for companionship rather than conversation, and he understood that, and she was grateful for it. A month later, on a warm May evening when the prairie was beginning to show its spring colors and the air smelled of something opening rather than closing, Jacob took her to walk along the edge of town, where the land opened up into the wide, flat expanse of the Kansas plain, the sky going amber and rose, and then gradually violet overhead. They stood where the last buildings ended and the prairie began, and the world in that direction was enormous and silent, the horizon impossibly far away in the plain's way that she had grown up knowing but never stopped finding startling. Jacob stood next to her, and for a while they just looked at it. "I want to ask you something," he said, and his voice had a quality that she recognized, the careful steadiness of a man who is asking something that matters. She turned to look at him. He had not gotten down on one knee, which she would have found, coming from him, slightly unlike him. He was standing and looking at her, level and honest. "I love you," he said. "I don't say that lightly. I'm not a man who says things lightly. I know that you've been through things that make trust expensive, and I know that what I'm asking is a large thing, but I'm asking whether you would marry me. Not immediately, if you're not ready. Not on any schedule but the one that's right for you. But I want to ask the question." She looked at him in the violet Kansas evening, this man who had asked what she still wanted before he asked anything else of her, who had listened more than he spoke, who had made room for her to be exactly herself, who had treated her intelligence as a fact rather than an inconvenience, who had loved her with a patience that never shaded into control. She thought about what she wanted. The actual answer, hers, no one else's. She found it was clear. "Yes," she said. "Not on any particular schedule, but yes." He breathed out, and she saw the relief in him, genuine and deep, the relief of someone who has hoped for something and found it real. He reached out and took her hand, and they stood at the edge of the prairie, and the sky went on getting dark above them, and she leaned against his shoulder because she wanted to, because it was her choice, because wanting and choosing were hers again and had been for some time now and would go on being. "Jacob," she said. "I'm happy." He pressed her hand. "So am I." They were married in July of 1883 in the Caldwell church, on a morning that was already warm at 10 o'clock and would be hot by noon. Mrs. Calloway wore her best dress and cried with the unashamed efficiency of a woman who has earned her emotions. Tom Mercer was there and shook Jacob's hand with the firm grip of a man who means every bit of it. Marshal Dern sat in the third row. Half the town came, because Jacob had been there 7 years and Effie had been there 9 months, and in both cases had done right by people, and in Caldwell that counted for a great deal. Effie's sister Ruth made the journey from Dodge City, arriving 2 days before the wedding with her husband and their 3 children, and the reunion between the sisters was long and quiet, and contained a great deal of what was not said aloud, which was fine, because they understood each other without all of it. Ruth met Jacob on the morning before the wedding and spent 30 minutes talking to him in the kitchen of the boarding house while Effie attended to other things. And when Effie came back, Ruth took her aside and said, in the direct way of a sister who has worried for a long time, "He's a good man." "I know," Effie said. "I mean it," Ruth said. "I was looking hard and I believe it." "I know that too," Effie said. "I looked harder." The ceremony was simple and straightforward, and exactly what they had wanted, which was a thing they had decided together. In the practical, collaborative way they had decided most things. There were no grand performances. The vows were the traditional ones, said plainly and meant entirely. When he put the ring on her finger, a plain gold band he had made himself in the smithy, she felt the cool weight of it and thought that she had made this choice with both eyes open and her heart clear, and that was not nothing. That was everything. The summer of 1883 settled around them like something earned. Effie continued at Mercer's through the summer, because she liked the work and because Tom Mercer needed her, and because her contribution to the household was her own, and she intended to keep it. Jacob continued the smithy, which was doing well, and began talking about the possibility of expanding, adding a second forge, maybe taking on an apprentice. They talked about these things in the evenings, sitting on the porch of the house Jacob had bought the previous spring when he had made up his mind about what he wanted. A plain, well-built house on the south side of Caldwell, with a kitchen garden that someone had planted and not kept, which Effie set about reclaiming with a methodical pleasure. She put in tomatoes and beans and 3 kinds of squash, and the garden responded to attention the way most living things do, with growth that was sometimes awkward and always remarkable. She kept the kitchen accounts the same way she kept the store accounts, with precision and pleasure. She cooked with a confidence that she had always had but had rarely been permitted to fully express, and Jacob ate everything she made with the genuine appreciation of a man who has spent years cooking for himself and knows the difference. They had the kind of arguments that good marriages have, over small things mostly, over the ordering of priorities, over whose tendency toward certainty was sometimes excessive and in which direction. She won some of these arguments, he won others. Neither of them won by attrition or by making the other feel diminished, and so they both came away from the arguments more or less intact, which was the relevant point. In November of 1883, she told him that she was expecting a child. He was in the kitchen when she told him, sitting at the table with the almanac open, planning orders for the following season. She told him plainly, as she told him most things, and he went still in the way that deep things made him still. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he stood up and came to her, and he held her with his arms around her and his chin against the top of her head, and neither of them said anything for a while. How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired," she said honestly. "Uncertain, but good, I'm feeling good." "Good," he said, and he held her a little tighter. She had always known in some abstract way that she had wanted children. It had been one of those wants that had been present in her before Gerald, and then had been lost under the weight of everything Gerald was, because she had understood, without ever quite putting words to it, that she did not want to bring a child into that house. Now the want was present again, specific and real, and the house was different, and she let herself be simply glad. The pregnancy was not easy. The winter was hard, and she was tired in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness, a deep fatigue that ran through her body like weather. She kept working at the store through December, more slowly, and Jacob came to walk her home every evening without being asked, in the simple, habitual way of someone for whom caring is not a grand gesture but a daily practice. Tom Mercer, when she told him, said, "I'll need help then," which was his way of saying that he was happy for her and that she should not worry about the work. And she hired a girl named Clara from the north part of town who was 17 and quick, and she spent the remainder of the pregnancy teaching Clara the system she had built, thoroughly enough that the store would be in good hands. The child was born in June of 1884, on a warm evening when the sky was clear, and the light had that long, golden quality of midsummer evenings on the plains. He was a boy. They named him Thomas James Abbott, Thomas for Tom Mercer, who had been unexpectedly moved by this honor, and James for Jacob's father, which Jacob had wanted and she had agreed to immediately. He was a solid, loud, opinionated infant who looked, within the first 24 hours, like a clear and specific person, which surprised her somewhat and then ceased to surprise her, because why would he be anything else? Ruth came from Dodge City when she heard, arriving 4 days after the birth with provisions and energy and the practical expertise of someone who had done this 3 times herself. And her presence was the gift that it was, steady and competent and warm. Jacob held Thomas with the careful, slightly awed manner of a man who has spent his working life managing large forces and heavy materials, and finds that a 6-pound person is somehow the most significant thing he has ever held. He talked to the baby the way he talked to the horses, in a low, steady voice, narrating the world in honest terms, and Effie watched them from the bed where she was resting, and felt something she had no adequate word for, something that was larger than happiness and more complex. She was, she thought, well, not recovered, because recovery implied going back to something, and she did not want to go back to anything. Arrived. She was arrived, somewhere she had chosen, in a life that was genuinely hers. The years in Caldwell after that settled into the shape of a good life, which is to say it was varied and imperfect, and had its difficult seasons and its brilliant ones, and through all of it the central fact remained. She was in it fully and freely, and that was a thing she did not take for granted on any ordinary Tuesday. Jacob expanded the smithy in 1885, taking on a young man named Sam Dooley as apprentice, a quiet, serious boy of 19 from a farm family east of town who had a natural affinity for the work, and who received the same steady, unhurried instruction that Jacob brought to everything. The business grew, and with it their income, and with it their capacity to make the house more of what they wanted. Effie put in a proper kitchen garden, expanded and organized, that became the envy of the neighboring women and the source of much of their table through the summer and fall. She kept a careful eye on the household accounts, and found satisfactions there she had not expected, the pleasure of a well-managed thing, of security built incrementally and owned fully. She stopped working at Mercer's regularly after Thomas was born, though she continued to consult on the accounts once a week, and to stop in when Tom Mercer was confused about something, which was often enough. Clara ran the store with a capable energy that was good to see. Tom Mercer was growing older, and sometimes Effie sat with him in the late afternoons when Clara was managing, and they drank coffee and talked about nothing in particular. And she valued these conversations because Tom Mercer had been one of the first things that was good about Caldwell, and she was grateful for him. He died in the winter of 1886, quietly in his sleep, which was the manner he would have chosen if he had been given the choosing. He left the store to Clara and a small sum to Effie, which surprised her and then made her cry in a way she had not expected, the tears coming from a deep place of gratitude for his uncomplicated decency. The store continued under Clara's management, and Caldwell continued its complicated evolution. By 1886, the great cattle drives that had defined the border town were ending, the railroads and the fencing of the open range changing the economy of the plains in ways that were reshaping every town from Caldwell south to the territory line. There was anxiety in this, the particular anxiety of a place whose identity has been built on something that is passing. But Caldwell was adapting, as places do, finding new reasons to exist and new trades to sustain them, and Jacob's business adapted with it, moving from the shoeing of cattle drive horses to the maintenance of farm equipment and wagons as the agricultural settlements expanded. In 1887, Effie found she was expecting again. This second pregnancy was smoother than the first, her body familiar now with the process. A daughter was born in April, whom they named Clara Abbott, Clara for the young woman who had run the store and for the spring quality of the month. Me because Effie had always liked the name for reasons she could not fully articulate and which she decided required no articulation. Thomas, who was nearly 3, received his sister with the complicated combination of interest and territorial concern that marked his age, and the household reorganized around the new presence, loudly and chaotically, and with great love. Ruth made the journey again because she was that kind of sister and stayed 2 weeks, and her children played with Thomas in the back lot, and the whole house was full of noise and food and the specific, irreplaceable warmth of family. Effie sat on the porch one morning during Ruth's visit in the April sun, with Clara me asleep against her shoulder and Thomas running circles around Ruth's eldest in the yard, and Jacob sitting beside her with his coffee, and she said, not to anyone in particular but out loud, "This is what I wanted." Jacob looked at her. "I didn't know it in this specific shape," she said. "I couldn't have drawn it, but this is it." He reached over and covered her free hand with his, the familiar weight of it, the work-warm solidity of it. "This is it," he agreed. Through the late 1880s, Caldwell changed and they changed with it in the way that living things change, gradually, toward more of what they already were. Jacob took on a second apprentice. Effie began, in the mornings before the children were fully awake, to write things down in a bound journal that she had bought from the new general store that had opened when Mercer's was sold after Clara married and moved north. She wrote practical things at first, household records, observations about the garden. Then she wrote other things, the story of coming into Caldwell on a horse with a thrown shoe and $3.40, the story of learning slowly what it was to be treated as a full person by someone who had no interest in diminishing her. She wrote, "I thought for a long time that surviving was the whole of what was available to me. I had gotten very good at surviving. And then I found, entirely without expecting it, that survival was only the beginning, that on the far side of it was the possibility of actually living, fully and freely, and on terms that were mine." She wrote, "He asked me once what I wanted, and I was so surprised by the question that I did not answer right away. I had to go home and sit with it. I had to learn what it was to want things again, to trust my own wanting. And when I learned it, what I wanted was this, to be seen truly, to work at something that mattered, to be loved without condition or control. And I have all of those things. I have all of them." She closed the journal and went to make breakfast, and the kitchen filled with the smell of coffee and the sound of Thomas, who was 4 now and had opinions about everything, and Clara me in her basket making the peaceful, oceanic sounds of an infant who has decided the world is broadly acceptable. Jacob came downstairs and said, "Good morning," in his ordinary voice, and she handed him his coffee and he kissed her temple, and both of these things were so ordinary and so good. The years continued. Thomas grew into a boy of particular energy and considerable stubbornness, who loved horses in the way his father did and who was, by 8 years old, spending hours at the smithy watching Sam Dooley work and asking questions that Sam answered with patient honesty. Clara me grew into a thoughtful girl who had Effie's directness and Jacob's steadiness, and a particular gift for observation, for noticing the small things that others moved past. In 1890, Effie attended a meeting organized by a group of women in Caldwell on the subject of education, specifically the quality of the school, which had been managed inconsistently since the previous teacher had left for Colorado. She went because she was interested in the subject and because she had strong opinions about it, and she left having agreed to serve on the organizing committee, which met twice a month and dealt with the school board and the matter of attracting and retaining a competent teacher. She was good at this. She was organized and persuasive and clear, and she had a way of cutting through disagreement to the practical center of a thing that other people found useful, and the school was better for her involvement in the specific, measurable way of better teachers and better materials, and a building that no longer let in wind through the east wall. Jacob, watching all of this, said one evening, "You know, you've been organizing this town for years and no one's quite noticed." "I've noticed," she said. "That's what I mean," he said. "You're not doing it for the credit." She looked at him. "I'm doing it because it needs doing and I'm good at it." "Yes," he said, "that's what I mean." She understood then that he saw her, still, in the same clear way he always had, and that the seeing had never narrowed or dimmed, had not been replaced by the familiarity that makes some men stop looking at what's actually there. He looked at her at 40 as if she were interesting, and she was, and he was, and that was their life. In 1891, Thomas turned 7 and Clara Me turned 4, and Jacob and Effie sat one winter evening with the children asleep and the fire low and talked about the future the way they talked about most things, openly and practically and without pretense. "Are you content?" he asked her, and it was not a question with a right answer because there never was with him. It was a real question. She thought about it. "I'm more than content," she said. "I'm satisfied. Is there a difference?" "What's the difference?" "Content sounds like settled, like you've stopped expecting things," she said. "I haven't stopped expecting things. I expect more good things to happen. I expect to keep being surprised by what this life turns out to be. That feels different from content." He smiled, the real smile, the one that started deep in his chest. "Then I'm satisfied too," he said. She leaned against him, and the fire made its small sounds, and the Kansas winter did what it had always done with complete indifference to anyone's happiness or unhappiness, and inside the house it was warm. She had come into Caldwell on a lame horse with $3.40 and a bruise on her cheek, and a decision in her chest that no man would make her feel like she owed him her silence. She had kept every part of that. She had also found, which she had not been expecting, a man who did not want her silence, who asked instead what she wanted, who had heard the answer and been glad of it and had built a life with her in which the wanting was equally distributed, equally honored, equally real. This was not a story she had expected to be able to tell. She had not known, riding down the main street of Caldwell on that October afternoon in 1882, that the world still had this in it. She had suspected, perhaps. She had hoped, in the careful, guarded way of someone who has learned that hope can be turned against you. But she had not known. She knew now. On a spring morning in 1893, when the Kansas prairie was coming back for the 11th time since she had arrived in Caldwell, Thomas, at 9 years old, helped his father shoe Fletcher's replacement, a young gray gelding named Post, and did it with a competence that made both his parents proud in a quiet, specific way. Clara Me, at 6, sat in the smithy doorway and sketched the scene in a small notebook she carried everywhere, her face set in the concentrated expression of a person recording something worth keeping. Effie stood in the doorway and watched all of them, her family in the morning light, and felt the particular feeling that has no single name, the layered, complex, specific gratitude of a person who knows what it costs to arrive where they are. Jacob looked up and saw her looking, and something passed between them in the warm spring air, the shorthand of people who have known each other long enough and well enough that a look can carry the weight of an entire conversation. He was asking if she was all right. She was telling him she was more than all right. She stepped out of the doorway and walked toward them, toward her son and her daughter and the man who had made a life with her, toward the ordinary, extraordinary morning of it, toward everything she had learned to want and had been brave enough to reach for, toward the life that was entirely, fully, irrevocably hers. The prairie spread out behind the smithy in every direction, enormous and indifferent and breathtaking, the sky above it so wide it seemed to include everything that had ever happened under it, all the hard winters and the bright summers, all the arriving and departing, all the deciding and the building and the learning to trust. The Kansas spring smelled of mud and new grass and iron from the forge, and it was all beautiful in the way that real things are beautiful, not because they are perfect, but because they are true. Effie Thatcher Abbott stood in the middle of all of it and was exactly where she was supposed to be, which was nowhere she had planned and everywhere she had needed. And that, in the end, was the whole and complete and perfect story of it.